Section 3. Americans from Asia. Chapter 6. The Chinese. Chinese Americans are part of a larger worldwide phenomenon of overseas Chinese, who are spread from Southeast Asia to the Caribbean. By 1930, more than 8 million Chinese had left China to settle around the world. These overseas Chinese have often become successful tradesmen, merchants, and bankers in societies where the native populations were desperately poor, arousing the same kind of resentment, political persecution, and sporadic violence to which Jews were long subjected in Europe. The Chinese have often been called the Jews of Asia. The overseas Chinese have worked in very similar occupations to those of the Jews and have lived their own separate cultural and social existence in a variety of host countries, also like the Jews. The skills and organizational abilities of the Chinese have made them valuable additions to many poor countries, while their affluence has made them political targets. The result has been an ambivalence toward them by the governments of such countries. Various Latin American nations have alternately encouraged and restricted Chinese immigration. As late as 1966, the government of the Solomon Islands debated deporting them all. There have been massacres of Chinese in Indonesia and Mexico. Currently, a quota system in Malaysia is restricting the access of the Chinese minority to desirable jobs or other economic opportunities in favor of native Malaysians. Many of the boat people forced out of Vietnam after the communist takeover have been overseas Chinese. Chinese Americans have always been a tiny part of the worldwide phenomenon of the overseas Chinese. Their story shows a distinctive interaction between the culture they brought and the circumstances they found in the United States. China. China has a long history as a nation and a culture going back thousands of years before Christ. For much of that period, China was economically, technologically, and organizationally the most advanced nation in the world. China in the 11th century had achieved a level of economic development not reached by any European nation until the 18th century. The oldest printed book in existence was printed in China in the 9th century. Cast iron existed in China 1,000 years before it existed in Europe. An iron and steel industry existed in China, producing over 100,000 tons of pig iron annually during the Sung dynasty, which lasted from the 10th to the 12th centuries. Marco Polo found a city of 2 million inhabitants in China at a time when the largest cities in Europe had no more than 50,000. As late as the 16th century, China had the highest standard of living in the world. The creation of the overseas Chinese was related to the decline of this great civilization. Both date from the Ming dynasty, 1368 to 1644. Governments dominated by reform-minded intellectuals assumed pervasive control of the economy and society, especially of large-scale business. In the last century of the Ming dynasty, there began an exodus that created the first large overseas Chinese communities. The skills and organizational abilities carried by these Chinese immigrants sustained their own prosperity and contributed to the decline and poverty of China itself. Much of modern history has seen the paradox of Chinese people prospering in countries throughout the world, but desperately poor in China itself. The Chinese who immigrated to the United States before World War II came overwhelmingly from one province, Guangdong, in southern China. Indeed, they were even more localized in origin, coming from just one of the 7 districts of that province, Taishan. This was very important in a highly regionalized country like China. The language of the original Chinese Americans was a Taishan dialect, similar to Cantonese, but so different from the dominant Mandarin Chinese language as to make the two dialects mutually incomprehensible. While China has long had a common written language, its spoken language has varied so greatly as to have many mutually unintelligible dialects. The post-World War II Chinese immigrants to the United States have typically spoken Mandarin Chinese, creating a language barrier between themselves and existing Chinese Americans. The regionalism of China, like that of Italy, derives from its topography. Mountains and hills fragment the country, and the basins of its two great rivers, the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze in the south, are very different. The racial homogeneity of the Chinese has not prevented them from seeing themselves as radically different groups of people, according to their respective regional, linguistic, and cultural backgrounds. Their turbulent and often brutal history has left a legacy of local clan loyalties and an enormous emphasis on the family as the individual's only dependable refuge. Implacable revenge against enemies of the family was a long-standing and deep tradition in China, again as in Italy. In modern China, weak and ineffective governments at local and national levels have led to autonomous centers of force and violence, clans, warlords, and secret societies. The modern Chinese secret societies, or tongs, like the mafia in southern Italy, were at one time popularly supported forces of resistance and revenge under oppressive alien overlords, and they too became criminals specializing in extortion. These secret societies, or tongs, became a common feature of overseas Chinese communities, including those in the United States. Another characteristic of the Chinese culture that was to follow the Chinese to the United States was respect for learning. Imperial China had for centuries chosen its civil servants according to their education and performance on examinations, and learned men were accorded great respect. It would be generations before Chinese Americans could obtain and utilize higher education in the United States, but they were prepared before the opportunity arose. Although China as a whole was, and is, predominantly agricultural, the Toishan district of Guangdong province is a rocky and almost barren plateau with little agriculture. Its people often turned to trade, acting as middlemen, salesmen, and merchants. Many of them traveled to the port of Hong Kong, where they became familiar with Europeans, and where they heard the fateful news of the discovery of gold in California in 1849. Thus began the Chinese immigration to America. The immigrant generation. Many of the Chinese came to the United States as contract laborers or on money borrowed from the Chinese American organizations that assumed a supervisory role toward them in the United States. Like other immigrants wholly unfamiliar with the language and culture of the United States, the Chinese laborers often worked in gangs under the supervision of a fellow countryman. The Chinese, although physically smaller than Americans, were hard workers in agriculture, railroad building, and other taxing physical labor. They also worked cheaply and lived frugally, saving money out of whatever would be considered a pittance by Americans. These very virtues, however, made the Chinese feared and hated as competitors by white workers. By 1851, there were 25,000 Chinese in California. By 1870, there were 63,000 in the United States, almost all on the West Coast. Almost 6,000 Chinese entered the United States in 1880, twice as many in 1881, and then 5 times as many in 1882. An exclusionary immigration law directed against the Chinese reduced the inflow to less than 1,000 until 1890, when 1,716 entered. The initial Chinese immigration was almost exclusively male. As in other cases, this indicated a tentative rather than a permanent move to the United States. Many were sojourners rather than immigrants. About half of the early Chinese who came to the United States did not stay. In the 1880s, the number of Chinese leaving the United States was greater than the number coming in. Partly this was a result of initial intentions to return to China after making money in the United States. Partly it was a result of unhappy experiences in this country. The reception of the Chinese immigrant in the United States was harsh and often violent. The Chinese were both non-white and non-Christian, at a time when either trait alone was a serious handicap. They looked different, dressed differently, ate differently, and followed customs wholly unfamiliar to Americans. They were considered incapable of being assimilated, culturally or biologically. They were feared as competitors whose harder work and longer hours for cheap pay would drive down the standard of living of American labor. Labor unions were in the forefront of decades-long efforts to exclude Chinese immigrants and to expel Chinese residents from the United States. In 1885, Chinese workers employed as strikebreakers were massacred at a Wyoming coal mine. Only the hardest, dirtiest, most menial jobs were open to them. Most of the laborers who laid the Central Pacific Railroad tracks through California and across the Sierra Mountain into Utah to drive the Golden Spike were Chinese. Chinese who tried to work as independent gold miners were forcibly driven from the mining camps by white miners in camps throughout the West. In 1885, the entire Chinese population of one California community was forced to leave by the threat of mob violence. At about the same time, Seattle and Tacoma, Washington, expelled their Chinese populations. Similar events occurred in Vancouver and Alaska. Casual harassment was a common occurrence in between these more dramatic assaults. Cutting off the long pigtail, or queue, worn by Chinese men was a popular prank, although one with serious consequences to the men, who could not return to China without it under the laws of the Manchu dynasty. Chinese immigrants arriving in San Francisco were escorted to Chinatown by street hoodlums with taunts, beatings, brickbats, and hurling of overripened fruit in an atmosphere of drunken Irish hilarity. But behind these harassments was the ever-present threat of more serious violence, which could erupt at any time. Mobs of whites sporadically burned and sacked Chinatowns on the West Coast and in the Rocky Mountain region, killing inhabitants as they went. In Los Angeles in 1871, a mob of whites shot, hanged, and otherwise killed about 20 Chinese in one night. In addition to attacks by hoodlum elements or mobs, the Chinese came under a different kind of attack by the more respectable classes. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 severely curtailed their immigration, and new laws first prevented Chinese already here from becoming naturalized American citizens, and then made citizenship a prerequisite for entering many occupations or even owning land. From 1854 to 1874, a law was in force preventing Chinese from testifying in court against white men, in effect declaring open season on the Chinese, who had no legal recourse when robbed, vandalized, or assaulted. The almost total exclusion of Chinese immigration had devastating long-run effects on Chinese Americans. Because the early Chinese immigration was almost exclusively male, all hope of a normal social or family life was destroyed for the great majority of the Chinese population of the United States. Many of these Chinese men had wives and children back in China, whom they would not see again for decades, if at all. The severe restrictions on economic opportunity meant that many could not even afford to return to China to resume a normal life. Passage to the United States could be arranged in exchange for labor to be performed here. Passage in the other direction, more than twice as far as to Europe, was a much more difficult obstacle. Many of those who came as sojourners were permanently stranded in the United States. Others who had thought of settling here with their families were prevented from bringing them over and were themselves prevented from becoming citizens. The smuggling of Chinese into the United States became a major activity after the imposition of severe immigration restrictions. Some were smuggled in for the usual reasons for immigration, but many were women, some as voluntary or forced prostitutes. The phrase, "not a Chinaman's chance," arose during this era to describe hopeless odds. The Chinese experience in Hawaii was much better than on the mainland of the United States. An early history of amicable relations between Polynesians and whites had created a climate of more relaxed interracial relations, including many people of mixed ancestry. The tremendous excess of single men among the Chinese immigrants led to marriage with Hawaiian women, while on the mainland marriage with white women was both socially and legally forbidden. The Chinese reached a high of 22% of the Hawaiian population in 1884. The influx of other groups to Hawaii reduced the Chinese proportion in later years. When Hawaii was annexed by the United States in 1898, the Chinese Exclusion Act was extended to that territory. Economic conditions. Where the Chinese were tolerated, it was in occupations urgently needed and that white men were reluctant to fill. Cooks and laundrymen in the mining camps, for example, or as domestic servants in the cities. The early Chinese were also agricultural field laborers, working long hours for low pay. In 1870, about 1/10 of all farm labor in California was Chinese, and by the mid-1880s, more than half were Chinese. The Chinese proved to be more diligent and conscientious than whites in such work. The Chinese were also found to be industrious and persevering, working in gangs laying railroad tracks. 10,000 Chinese workers helped to build the Central Pacific Railroad. The Chinese in the United States were quite different from the overseas Chinese elsewhere. The merchants, bankers, and educated Chinese did not come to the United States to face insults, discrimination, and violence. The poorer, less educated, often younger and less experienced Chinese came. With the passage of time, the Chinese either left or were driven out of mining camps, agricultural field labor, and railroad gangs. They typically settled in cities in California, and some dispersed eastward. Those American employers who hired Chinese were subjected to harassment and threats, so the Chinese were left with little more than self-employment or work as domestic servants. For several decades, their principal occupation was as laundrymen. Chinese restaurants were another major source of jobs. These were usually located in Chinese communities, or Chinatowns, to minimize the appearance of competing with whites. Even as late as 1920, more than half of all employed Chinese in the United States worked either in laundries or restaurants. Laundries were far more numerous than restaurants because laundries require very little capital to start and require less knowledge of English to conduct. Although severely restricted to two main kinds of work, Chinese succeeded in those areas. The Chinese hand laundry became an American institution. So too did the food created in Chinese restaurants for Americans: chop suey, chow mein, and fried rice, none of them authentic dishes from China. In addition, Chinese grocery stores opened in Chinatowns to supply the kinds of food preferred by the Chinese themselves. Even in their constricted world, the Chinese continued to be harassed by legal impositions. Special taxes and fees were applied to the kinds of businesses conducted by Chinese or conducted in the Chinese manner. For example, license fees in 19th century San Francisco were higher for laundries that did not deliver by horse and buggy, and it was made a misdemeanor to carry baskets suspended on a pole across the shoulder, the way the Chinese delivered. The Chinese reaction to pervasive discrimination was withdrawal and inconspicuousness, much like the European Jews in the ghetto or the Pale. Chinatowns developed their own community organizations and leaders to conduct their own internal affairs, with an absolute minimum of recourse to the institutions of the larger society around them. This was a common pattern also among overseas Chinese in Asia and elsewhere. In the United States, the Chinese leaders deliberately kept out of the courts and out of the political arena. This was possible in part because the Chinese in America lived in tight-knit communities of people from one district of one province in China. In those enclaves, they kept alive and intact a culture, a set of traditions and values that was eroding in China itself. The source of power for the leaders of American Chinatowns was not political popularity, but wealth and access to the use of force. The Chinese employers who dominated civic organizations could purge either political radicals or trade unionists by the simple expedient of denying jobs or credit, at a time when the larger society offered very few economic opportunities to Chinese, and even fewer social opportunities. The internal Chinese organizations could determine who could work where, and who could open a business where, and with what financing. Economic and social pressure was supplemented by physical force. The secret societies, or tongs, that existed in China and in other overseas Chinese communities also existed in American Chinatowns. Their use of the hatchet as a weapon in the 19th century led to the term hatchet man, now applied to a wide variety of other activities. The tongs hatchet men, however, graduated to revolvers and machine guns as part of their assimilation to American society. The tongs divided territory for the prostitution, gambling, and opium use that were common activities among the homeless and womanless men who made up the bulk of early Chinatown inhabitants. These tongs had sporadic outbreaks of violence. There were particularly bloody Tong wars in Chinatown in the 19th century, and new outbreaks from time to time in the 20th century, as late as 1931. Despite these sensational Tong wars that made newspaper headlines, most Chinese Americans remained quiet and nonviolent. Social conditions. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of the early Chinese immigrants was that a people so dedicated to the family were denied the possibility of having families in America. After immigration from China was unilaterally curtailed by the United States in 1882, the result was a greater imbalance between the sexes than in any other ethnic group. In 1860, there were almost 20 Chinese men for every Chinese woman in the United States. By 1890, there were about 27 Chinese men for every Chinese woman. As late as 1930, the ratio was still 4-1. Many of the early Chinese were obviously unable to produce children under these circumstances. This meant that the cultural assimilation of the group as a whole was retarded. The virtual absence of an American-born second generation not only statistically left most of the Chinese population foreign-born until about 1940, but it also meant that the absorption of the English language and American customs via the school was delayed, and that the usual role of second-generation children in helping their parents become acculturated was aborted. The Chinese men were often trapped in the United States without the possibility of normal family life, and at the same time unable, because of poverty, to get passage back to China. Many thousands of these intended sojourners lived out lonely lives as permanent residents in a country where they neither were wanted nor wanted to be. Clans remained strong among the Chinese in America as in China. Clan leaders were both economic and social powers. A Chinese merchant usually assumed leadership of his clan, established a hostelry about the store for his kinsmen, and provided aid, advice, contact, and shelter. Because of the relatively small number of Chinese in the United States, some clans combined to act as one clan. Clans kept trade secrets and limited the entry of new stores, laundries, or restaurants. Different clans dominated the Chinatowns of different cities. In addition to clans, various mutual aid organizations arose to act as employment agencies, rotating credit associations, mediators, and social organizations. Because of its many functions, it could command the respect or acquiescence of individual Chinese, who would be bereft of many needed services and comforts in a foreign land without it. Various Chinese-American mutual aid organizations have consolidated to ultimately form the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, popularly known as the Six Companies, acting as a unified voice for Chinatown, and speaking also for Chinese Americans generally. The moral, economic, and social pressures of the clan, the Six Companies, and the Tongs, both independently and as enforcers for the other groups, made American Chinatowns very self-enclosed communities. Chinatowns in the last quarter of the 19th century were centers of vice, not only for the Chinese, but for whites seeking prostitution, drugs, and gambling. The Chinese introduced opium into the United States. The white clientele of Chinatown vice districts were often ruffians and hoodlums, who added to the dangerousness of an area where Tong violence might break out at any time. The shabby-looking, vice-infested, and violence-prone Chinatowns of this era were used by anti-Chinese elements as arguments for continued immigration restrictions, although in fact existing immigration restrictions were a major part of the reason for such conditions. Later generations. With the passage of years, the few Chinese women in the United States produced a small second generation of children, and these children grew up to slightly ease the serious sex imbalance that remained characteristic of Chinese Americans on up through World War II. There were also an unknown number of Chinese women smuggled into the United States, some for the explicit purpose of prostitution, among a large but unknown number of other Chinese smuggled in during the long era of immigration restrictions. It is known that, as recently as 1960, many Chinatown residents deliberately avoided the census takers for fear of discovery of their illegal immigrant status. Some well-to-do merchants had wives who were elaborately secluded from view, much less contact, with the many Chinese males. A very small percentage of the Chinese men married. In New York, into the early decades of the 20th century, just over half of the few Chinese men who married non-Chinese women. This percentage tended to decline over the next decades as more Chinese females became available. As the total number of Chinese males who married increased, the proportion of intermarriages dropped to about 1/4 in the 1920s and 1930s. Most of the non-Chinese women they married were white. Although most Chinese males lived alone, they were usually not, in fact, single. As of 1910, there were more married than single Chinese men living in the United States, but the great bulk of their wives were living abroad. Despite the prevalence of prostitution, opium dens, and gambling in Chinatowns, the Chinese men also sent substantial remittances to their families in China. With the great majority of Chinese Americans being from one district of one province, the remittances from America were concentrated in one place, and this place, Taishan, became one of the most prosperous districts in China. Its streets were paved and lit by electric lights. It continued to have the best educational facilities in the province, on into the time of the Chinese Communist government in the middle of the 20th century. These schools had been built and maintained by remittances from Chinese in America. Civic projects in Taishan were financed by canvassing Chinese in America, collecting small sums from the laundrymen, restaurant workers, and other workers whose poverty by American standards nevertheless represented prosperity by Chinese standards. From 1938 to 1947, for example, an average of $7 million a year was sent from the United States to China. The subculture of the stranded sojourner in Chinatown slowly eroded away as these men grew old and died off, or, in more fortunate cases, amassed enough money to return to China. The crime rates fell in Chinatowns with the decline of the stranded sojourner element. Between 1900 and 1927, 2/3 of all arrests of Chinese in the United States were for 3 crimes most associated with the sojourners: prostitution, drugs, and gambling. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, more than 70% of the Chinese patients at the Drug Treatment Center in Lexington, Kentucky, had been born in China. Over 90% worked in laundries or restaurants in the United States, and more than 60% were over 50 years old. During the same period, the suicide rate among Chinese in San Francisco was 3 times the national average, and almost all among men born in China. This was all part of the tragic prices of laws and practices that made it nearly impossible for the first generation of Chinese in America either to prosper here or to return home to their families. Modification of the immigration laws in 1930 permitted some small number of wives from China to join their husbands in the United States. The repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 in 1943 and new legislation permitting limited immigration from China in 1945 helped ease the sex imbalance and permitted more normal family life to develop among this very family-oriented people. The bulk of the new Chinese immigration was female, and the female preponderance was concentrated among young people of marriageable years. More than 8,000 Chinese men brought their wives to the United States within a few years. Some of them were reunited after decades of separation, sometimes with mutual shock on seeing each other again. Many men went back to China to get married, often using the traditional services of a matchmaker. Even among Chinese marrying within the United States in this era, a substantial proportion were marrying mates chosen by parents and or matchmakers, with varying degrees of assent by the parties themselves. Economic conditions. Despite the highly restricted economic opportunities for early Chinese Americans, the Chinatown communities took care of their own indigence. Even such disasters as the San Francisco earthquake of 1906 and the Great Depression of the 1930s did not force the Chinese to resort to public assistance. Although San Francisco's Chinatown was burned out by the fires that followed the Great Earthquake of 1906, leaving many homeless, the Chinese in San Francisco received far less aid than in proportion to their numbers, and few even applied for public assistance. Instead, internal Chinese American community organizations collected money from Chinese in other cities to provide relief and rehabilitation. Even when the Great Depression was at its worst in the early 1930s, few Chinese received federal unemployment relief. Whereas 10% of the whites in Chicago received federal employment relief in 1933, only 4% of the Chinese did so. In New York, 9% of the whites but only 1% of the Chinese received this aid. Similar patterns were found in other cities. During this period, some Chinese family associations made a practice of keeping a barrel of rice open in the foyer so that a hungry member visiting could privately remove what he needed for himself or his family and privately return it when his circumstances permitted. The ferocious anti-Chinese feelings of the 19th century, when Chinese competed directly with white workers, could not be maintained indefinitely at the same fever pitch after the Chinese withdrew into their own enclaves and offered neither competition nor resistance to whites. Chinatowns became tourist attractions. Their image was carefully controlled by their own internal organizations, which took care of its poverty and other problems themselves as much as possible, and which raised virtually no political protests. Isolated individual Chinese, especially of the younger generation, who were American-born and therefore citizens, were sent to college and made their way unobtrusively into a few professional occupations. These pioneers provided examples and arguments against the stereotype of the Chinese as unassimilable aliens and in favor of more acceptance. These unspectacular tactics, combined with a lessening of American racism in general and of anti-Chinese feeling in particular, resulted in an increase in Chinese professionals, both relatively and absolutely. As of 1940, only 3% of Chinese Americans in California were in the professions, while 8% of whites were. By 1950, the Chinese percentage had approximately doubled to 6%, and the white percentage had risen to 10%. In the next decade, however, the proportion of Chinese who were professionals tripled to 18%, passing the whites at 15%. Paradoxically, in Hawaii, where there had always been less hostility to the Chinese than on the mainland, the advance of the Chinese was not quite so great, absolutely or relative to whites. Some indication of how far the Chinese had come is that, as of 1900, the proportion of Chinese and Japanese in the professions was lower than that of blacks, and more than twice as high a percentage of Orientals as of blacks were domestic servants. The initial entering wedge of college-educated Chinese in the United States was very small, less than 2% of all Chinese over 25 years of age in 1940. But of this tiny group, more than 80% entered the professions, mostly scientific professions. As the number of college-educated Chinese youth increased over the next 20 years to 20% of all workers, the fields of work remained relatively stable. As of 1960, just over half of all Chinese Americans in the professions were in science, accounting, engineering, drafting, and college teaching, and more than half the college teachers were teaching engineering or the natural sciences. Much of the initial economic rise of the Chinese, however, was not in professions in the larger society, but in businesses in Chinatown itself. Lack of access to banks and other financial institutions in the larger society could not prevent Chinese businesses from being established. Rotating credit associations were an old institution among the southern Chinese, by which money could be pooled and used for investment. The device itself was quite simple. Each member, in his turn, had access to the pooled resources of all, but what made it successful was that default on repayment was extremely rare. A strong sense of individual and family honor made it unlikely that anyone would fail to repay the pool, and his family would probably make restitution if he did. The device was not unique to the Chinese. What was crucial was that the whole constellation of Chinese values, particularly the honor of the family, made it viable, whereas defaults would have ruined the whole scheme. The rotating credit associations remained the primary instrument for raising capital in Chinatowns on into the 1950s. The labor shortages of World War II opened many new job opportunities for the Chinese, as it did for other ethnic groups and for women. Many Chinese abandoned traditional Chinatown occupations to move into these new jobs. The diligent work habits and lack of need for supervision, which had marked the Chinese workers from the first generation in America, now proved to be decisive advantages in the labor market, once the discriminatory barriers came down. By 1960, there were fewer Chinese Americans in manual occupations than in the professions and business. The average income of Chinese Americans in 1959 was higher than that of other Americans. Along with this spectacular economic rise came more residential dispersions of Chinese Americans. Most Chinese Americans no longer live in Chinatowns, which are occupied by the aging sojourners left stranded from an earlier immigration, and by new refugees repeating much of the poverty experience of earlier generations of Chinese Americans, working long hours at low pay in Chinese restaurants or light industry. The aged sojourners and the new refugees are behind the paradoxes that, 1. Chinatowns have more than their share of low-income people, despite the above-average incomes of Chinese Americans as a group, and that, 2. The illiteracy rate among Chinese Americans is much higher than the national average, several times that among blacks, even though Chinese Americans as a group have above-average levels and qualities of education. Social conditions. Unlike other immigrant groups, the Chinese population in the United States decreased over the decades. There were 107,000 Chinese in 1890, but only 61,000 in 1920. Chinese were dying and leaving the country, but few were coming in to replace them. However, the downward trend eventually reversed, as the proportion of women rose and more Chinese children were born in the United States. The Chinese American population rose to 75,000 in 1930, and by 1950 was higher than it had been at the previous peak in 1890. The shabby and sordid Chinatowns of the late 19th and early 20th centuries began to change with the changes in the demographic composition of Chinese Americans. The aging, death, or repatriation of sojourners reduced the demand for Chinatown vice industries. The beginnings of the Chinatown restaurant and tourism industries created economic incentives for the suppression of the violence and sordidness that reduced the tourist appeal of the Chinese community. In addition, the The slow but steady growth of family formation among the Chinese created another element opposed to crime and violence in Chinatowns, a small but ever-growing part of the Chinese American population. In the early decades of the 20th century, the balance of power within Chinatowns tipped against the criminal Tongs. The 6 companies ordered their member merchants to refuse to pay any more protection money to the Tongs. Chinatown residents began to cooperate with police in apprehending and prosecuting criminals and the corrupt policemen who had long protected Tong activities. All of this would have been unheard of in an earlier era. Where vice could not be stamped out, gambling being an old custom among Cantonese, it was driven underground. Under pressure from Chinese businessmen trying to attract tourists, remaining gambling dens were kept hidden away from tourists' views and were no longer open to people from outside the Chinese community. The physical rehabilitation of Chinatowns was also undertaken by Chinese leaders, who decorated these areas with the famous pagoda-like designs typical of Chinatowns today. Tourism flourished in the new Chinatowns. Chinese festivals and parades received police protection and became civic events attracting large crowds of non-Chinese. The declining profitability of vice and the rising profitability of tourism caused some of the Tongs themselves to abandon crime in favor of restaurants and shops serving the new tourist trade. Many dropped the name Tong and substituted Merchant Association. Although sophisticated organized crime existed in Chinatowns, the average Chinese American was very law-abiding, a parallel to the situation among Italian Americans. The decline of organized crime in Chinatowns, therefore, meant a declining incidence in crime in general there. A survey in 1946 showed only 1 arrest for alcoholism over an 8-year period in New York's Chinatown, and no arrest at all for murder or any other major crime during that period. The new generations of Chinese children born in America encountered many of the language difficulties of other immigrant children, and sometimes attended schools explicitly segregated, as in San Francisco at the turn of the century, or with a concentration of Chinese children due to residential concentration. The Chinese children did equally well in school, whether concentrated in all Chinese schools or scattered among other ethnic groups. Some early studies of Chinese IQs showed them below the national average, but by the 1930s, Chinese youngsters' IQs were at or above the national average, and remained so. Teachers in New York's Chinatown rated the Chinese children better behaved, more obedient, and more self-reliant than their white classmates. American-born Chinese youngsters automatically escaped the anti-Chinese laws that forbade non-citizens to enter various occupations or to exercise various rights. The new generation of Chinese Americans entered a different world from that faced by their parents and were well equipped to advance in that world. With the belated appearance of a substantial second generation of Chinese Americans, the intergenerational tensions common to immigrant groups began. The traditional parent-arranged marriage was a special point of contention with American-bred offspring. But compromises kept Chinese American families close-knit, and by American standards, strong parental authority remained the rule, with the parents emotionally more distant from their children than among other Americans. There has long been a very low incidence of juvenile delinquency among Chinese American youth, although in earlier times, when Chinatowns were crime-ridden, the few Chinese youths there were also heavily involved. The general sympathy of Americans for China, especially after its invasion by Japan, helped the acceptance of Chinese Americans, now seen as a quiet, orderly group living in a problem-free community, or at least one whose problems seldom came to the attention of the larger society. The traditional role of women has been very subordinate in Chinese culture, at least outwardly. Yet even in China itself, Chinese men have for centuries had the reputation of being among the most henpecked in the world. Among Chinese Americans, the lopsided sex ratio alone gave women considerable leverage. While Chinese American husbands are, to all outward appearances, rulers of their families, it is not uncommon for the wife to make most of the major family decisions, and not confined to domestic concerns. Although Chinese families are traditionally larger, including those in America until recent times, by 1970, the average number of children per Chinese American woman was only 2. Among women aged 35 to 44, those with less than 9 years of schooling averaged 3.5 children, while those with a college education averaged just under 3. The Hong Kong Chinese. After the Communists took control of China in 1949, hordes of refugees from all over the country poured into the British colony of Hong Kong. Many eventually found their way to the United States. As a result of changing American immigration laws, the Chinese population of the United States almost doubled, from 237,000 to 435,000, in the decade of the 1960s. Many of the new arrivals settled in the Chinatowns that most Chinese Americans had left or were leaving. In the largest Chinese American community, in San Francisco, the population density per square mile was 3 times the citywide average in 1960 and 6 times the citywide average just 3 years later. The Chinese populations of New York, Los Angeles, Boston, and Chicago all more than doubled during the decade of the 1960s. About 20,000 Chinese legally entered the United States annually from Hong Kong and Taiwan, and it is estimated that an equal number also entered illegally. This new immigration has been very different from the old. The traditional Chinese American community consisted of people from one regional culture, a culture carefully preserved in the United States, even as it changed in China. Chinatowns had not only strong nuclear families, but also were crisscrossed with community organizations, such as clans, tongs, and the 6 companies. The Hong Kong refugees were not part of this culture, and usually neither spoke nor understood the Taishanese dialect that dominated American Chinatowns. Yet they also did not speak English and could not readily disperse through American society. Although embarking for the United States from Hong Kong, their regional origins in China were diverse. For many decades, Chinese Americans had escaped the divisive regionalism of China because of their own highly localized origins of one district of one province. Now they began to experience the divisiveness that had long been a problem among immigrants from a similarly regionalized country, Italy. The new immigrants and their many problems were resented by the established Chinese Americans, not only for the problems they directly caused, but also for the disgrace they were felt to bring on Chinese Americans in general. The Hong Kong Chinese were not only from different regions of China, they were also partly westernized in Hong Kong. The traditional Chinese values and constraints, especially the family, were no longer so dominant among them as among Chinese Americans. The difference between youths from Hong Kong Chinese families and those from traditional Chinese American families was particularly dramatic. Traditional Chinese American youths were kept busy with schoolwork, sometimes supplemented with Chinese school after the public school day was over, or by work helping in the family business. Despite inevitable generational conflicts as Americanization proceeded, the traditional Chinese American youngsters seldom had occasion to deal with polices or judges. The new Hong Kong Chinese youths, however, were often problems in the schools and on the streets. They disdained the menial jobs opened to unskilled people in Chinese restaurants or shops, and instead hung out on street corners and engaged in gang activities. Crime and violence have increased dramatically in Chinatowns across the United States, from New York to Honolulu. Hong Kong Chinese youth gangs have insulted and harassed the tourists on whom the Chinatown economy is dependent. They have also engaged in vandalism, violence, extortion, theft, terrorism, and murder. Like youth gang members of other groups, they can be seen in Chinatowns strutting down the street in bright peacock colors. They can also be found dead in the street when gang warfare erupts. There were about 200 youth gang murders in New York's Chinatown in 1973, a community in which such activities were unheard of just a generation ago. In San Francisco's Chinatown, one youth gang alone has 400 members. Some Chinese youth gangs have branches in various cities. The adult Hong Kong Chinese typically are hard-working and hard-pressed. As recent, unskilled, unacculturated, and often illegal arrivals, they work long hours at low pay and live in overcrowded and dilapidated housing, infested with rats and roaches. Some are paying off debts incurred in making large bribes to Hong Kong officials for permission to immigrate to the United States, or are paying off smugglers who got them into the United States illegally. Many of the Hong Kong Chinese are vulnerable to illegally low wages and illegally long hours of work, and to illegally bad housing conditions, because either they or some member of their family is living in the United States illegally, and would be deported if the authorities were to learn of it. Over 6,000 illegal Chinese immigrants have been deported annually. Just over half the men in New York's Chinatown work in restaurants. 3/4 of the women operate sewing machines in Chinatown's garment district. The proportion of families living in poverty in New York's Chinatown is more than twice the citywide average. Because of long hours, especially in restaurants that do most of their business at night, many of the immigrant Chinese families can have only a few meals together all week. The children are often left to grow up on the street. The Hong Kong Chinese in other cities live under similar conditions. While the adult Hong Kong Chinese fled the oppression of communist China and sought better economic opportunities in the United States than in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Chinese youth compared their lot not with China or Hong Kong, but with the lot of other American youths, including better educated and more prosperous traditional Chinese American youths. The Hong Kong Chinese have also seen the traditional Chinese Americans as landlords and employers of their parents, who earn less and pay more than other Americans. The Hong Kong Chinese youths have tended to be bitterly resentful of Americans and, the supreme irony, favorable toward Maoism, which caused their families to flee China in the first place. This has created an additional source of friction within the Chinese American community, which has steadfastly supported the nationalist government on Taiwan. The leaders of the Chinatown communities have faced a dilemma in dealing with the Hong Kong Chinese. Because Chinatowns are so dependent on tourism, open discussion of the poverty, crime, and violence there could reduce tourism and therewith the livelihoods of many of its inhabitants and the profitable businesses of the Chinese leaders. They have been very reluctant to apply for federal anti-poverty programs of various sorts, or to invite government presence in a community where so many are so vulnerable to any exposure of illegal conditions, notably immigration, housing, and working conditions. Internal accommodation has been sought by either buying off or scaring off Hong Kong Chinese youth gangs. Many Chinese restaurants in New York serve gang members free meals. Some Chinatown businesses pay them protection money. Some tongs in San Francisco employ youth gang members as lookouts in the gambling dens or to curb other gangs. The Hong Kong youth gangs in Chinatown are threats not so much to traditional Chinese Americans, most of whom do not live in Chinatowns, but to tourists and their much-needed spending. Hoodlums on the streets discourage tourism, especially when they call the tourists honkies or otherwise harass or rob them. But even when gang activities are not specifically directed against tourists, they affect tourism. Some tongs in San Francisco's Chinatown have themselves retaliated against youth gang members. They issued a public warning to those who engage in unruly behavior harmful to the commercial and social life of our community. The bound bodies of 5 Hong Kong Chinese youths were shortly thereafter found floating in San Francisco Bay. More conservative Chinese leaders have encouraged more vigorous police action in Chinatowns, including the liberal use of billy clubs on the heads of the young hoodlums. Far from complaining about police brutality, Chinatown leaders have encouraged the police to administer curbstone justice. They have been concerned only to minimize public discussions of this or any other negative news from Chinatown. Sometimes they have appealed to newspapers to downplay news that could hurt the vulnerable tourist industry on which Chinatown depends, and at other times they have simply bribed reporters. Chinese Americans today. Chinese Americans today have higher incomes than Americans in general and higher occupational status. 1/4 of all employed Chinese Americans are working in scientific and professional fields. The Chinese have risen to this position despite some of the harshest discrimination and violence faced by any immigrants to the United States in the history of this country. Long confined to a narrow range of occupations, they succeeded in those occupations and then spread out into other areas in later years, when opportunities finally opened up for them. Today, much of the Chinese prosperity is due to the simple fact that they work more and have more, and usually better, education than others. Almost 1 out of 5 Chinese families has 3 or more income earners, compared to 1 out of 13 for Puerto Ricans, 1 out of 10 among American Indians, and 1 out of 8 among whites. When the Chinese advantages in working and education are held constant, they have no advantage over other Americans. That is, in a Chinese family, with a given number of people working and with a given amount of education by the head of the family, the income is only about average for such families, and often a little less than average. There's a chart here of family earnings of Chinese American male-headed families, Chinese income as percent of U.S. income in the same categories. Education of family head. Less than high school. In 1-income families is 98%. In 2-income families is 98%. 3 or more incomes, 97%. High school. 92% in 1-income families. In 2-income families, 105%. In 3 or more incomes, 100%. College, 1 to 3 years. 1-income families, it's 80%. 2-income families is 94%. 3 or more incomes is 106%. College, 4 years. For 1-income families, it's 82%. For 2-income families, it's 99%. For 3 or more incomes, it's 106%. For postgraduate, 1 year. In 1-income families, that's 75%. In 2-income families, it's 86%. In 3 or more incomes, it's 148%. And lastly, postgraduate, 2 years or more. In 1-income families, it's 93%. In 2-income families, it's 96%. And with 3 or more incomes, it's 107%. Oriental academics, scientists, and engineers typically have significantly higher qualifications than either blacks or whites. That is, a higher proportion of the Orientals, Japanese and Chinese in this case, have PhDs, and especially PhDs from the higher-ranked universities. Among academics, Orientals publish more than either blacks or whites. Among notable Chinese Americans have been 3 Nobel Prize winners, all in physics. Another Chinese American physicist, a woman, helped develop America's first atomic bomb during World War II. In architecture, I.M. Pei's striking designs have become famous. His well-known buildings include the Hancock Tower and the John F. Kennedy Library in Boston, and the spectacular annex to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Many Chinese Americans have become prosperous in business. As early as 1939, a Chinese immigrant workman named Zhou Shong had built up a chain of stores that gave him the second highest income in the state of California. Gerald Tsai Jr. is today president of a Wall Street firm with more than $400 million in assets. Another Chinese American, C.Y. Tung, is one of the largest individual ship owners in the world and spent more than $3 million for a single ship. In politics, the Chinese have only recently made an appearance. Among the first Chinese Americans to hold political office was Wing F. Ong, elected to the Arizona state legislature in 1946 by a predominantly white electorate, which contained only 13 Chinese. The most famous Chinese American political figure has been Hiram Fong, U.S. Senator from Hawaii from 1959 to 1976, after having first served for 14 years in Hawaii's territorial legislature. While Chinese Americans as a group are prosperous and well-educated, Chinatowns are pockets of poverty, and illiteracy is much higher among the Chinese than among Americans in general. These paradoxes are due to sharp internal differences. Descendants of the Chinese Americans who immigrated long ago from Taishan province have maintained Chinese values and have added acculturation to American society with remarkable success. More recent Hong Kong Chinese are from more diverse cultural origins and acquired Western values and styles in Hong Kong without having acquired the skills to prosper and support those aspirations in the American economy. Foreign-born Chinese men in the United States earn 1/4 lower incomes than native-born Chinese American men with the same education and other advantages, even though the foreign-born have been in the United States an average of 17 years. While the older Hong Kong Chinese work tenaciously to sustain and advance themselves, the Hong Kong Chinese youths often react with resentment and antisocial behavior, including terrorism and murder. The need to maintain tourism in Chinatowns causes the Chinese leaders to mute or downplay these problems as much as possible. There are today only about 11% more Chinese men than Chinese women in the United States, and much of the remaining sex imbalance is among older Chinese who came to the United States in an earlier era. Among Chinese Americans of marriageable ages, the sexes are more or less evenly balanced. In this, as in so many other areas, there has been great progress. Families remain strong among Chinese Americans. Almost 90% of all Chinese American families have both husband and wife present. Nearly 80% of Chinese American males in their mid-30s to mid-40s are married and living with their wives. In contrast to the high rates of intermarriage during the era of great sex imbalance, 87% of Chinese men today are married to Chinese women. Less than 10% of Chinese Americans are divorced. As a group, Chinese Americans have, in one sense, integrated into American society occupationally and residentially, while retaining their own values and ethnic identity. It is no small achievement against great odds.